Yes, we had our first baptism service last week, and that was amazing. So I think October was one of the best months in the short history of this church. Then to top off the month of October, you have me preaching. What an anticlimax. This morning, I want to talk about a few things. The text I'll be primarily using is Genesis chapter 22. It's a very powerful chapter. It's about a very famous story in the Old Testament of how Abraham was tested and asked to offer up his son Isaac. And there's, the Old Testament is full of these pictures and what's called types and shadows. People who listen to the Theonauts will probably they did a bit of a series on this at one time, and if you don't listen to the Theonauts, I encourage you to listen to that particular podcast. It's very, very interesting and very entertaining sometimes. Sometimes. But it's very, very very, very easy to get a lot of passages in the Bible wrong. The reason I picked this particular passage, this particular story, is because of work, conversations I had in work, and how people just miss the point. People just say, they don't really get the point of this, and I don't really get the point of this story as well. But as you look through it, you see all these kind of threads tying together about faith and how we should be faithful and how God is faithful to us. And so I'll start in verse 1. At this time, Abraham was living, he had just made a treaty with Elimelech. He had basically screwed up and gave his wife Sarah to Elimelech to be his wife. He's now dwelling in that land after he kind of made a treaty of it. It's a very interesting story. Sometime later, this is verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. And in the first verse, we see how God has talked to Abraham, and Abraham makes himself available. Abraham is a man who was from the Ur of the Chaldees originally. He wasn't brought up as a worshipper of God. I believe he was someone who actually worshipped like the sun and the moon and stuff. He was kind of a pagan. But God calls him to leave his father's household in Ur of the Chaldees, which is modern day Iraq. It was Babylon before that, and a whole host of other places. And Abraham, on faith, follows God to where God calls him. So this is faith is a very big feature of Abraham's story, and I think no more important than this narrative. And then going on to verse 2. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, to the region of Moriah, and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. So God throws down the challenge. God has challenged Abraham's faith. In many ways, God is asking Abraham, do you love me more than you love Isaac? And we'll find out in the next verse the answer. Early the next morning, this is verse 3, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey and took with him 2 servants and his son Isaac. When they had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go up over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. So, without questioning, Abraham follows God's instructions to the T. But you'll notice that the place was 3 days' journey away. This gave Abraham time to consider what he was going to do. And it's amazing how little argument there is in these chapters, in this chapter, because he just says, Abraham had all these promises about his son Isaac. Isaac was to be through Isaac, Abraham was to be the father of many nations. Isaac's birth is a miracle in and of itself. Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. Now, the oldest person in this room, I believe, is 84 years of age. And the thought of that person bearing a child is quite frankly weird. It really is. And but here's this 90-year-old woman who has given birth to a child. This child of promise, this miracle child. And now God has asked Abraham to sacrifice him. But it's very interesting to look at what Abraham says here. If I can find the place again. He said to his servants, "We will worship, then we will come back to you." And in Hebrews chapter 11:17, this will probably be a bit of a spoiler alert, but you've all probably been to Sunday school, so heard this many, many times. If I can find it, I should have put a bookmark in it. Hebrews 11, by the way, is sometimes called the Faith Hall of Fame, where all these Old Testament characters, demonstrate their faith and how it's applicable. So in verse 17 of that very famous chapter, it says, "By faith, when God tested Abraham, offered Isaac as a sacrifice, he who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.' Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death." So that's a bit of a spoiler alert, that Isaac does actually come down the mountain again. But it's a very powerful thing that, even way thousands of years before Jesus came, people who were faithful of God believed God could raise the dead. And, God raised the dead, of course, through Jesus. We're going to, in a few moments, talk about that in communion. But, God, that's why I'm saying there's also all these kinds of types and shadows in the Old Testament. And this is one that's packed full of these types and shadows, because, the fact that we're Christians here today, I don't think is an accident. I don't want to go too Calvinistic or whatever and talk about election or whatever, but, I don't believe it's an accident that we're here today in Savoy, thousands of years later, talking about this in the light of Christ. And it's, I think God's redemptive power has been evident not from Calvary in 2,000 years ago, but from the very beginning. From Genesis 1 verse 1, as David talked about a few weeks ago, God's redemptive plan has been there from the very, very beginning, and we're seeing this very much in this narrative. Then Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. Then there again, another picture of Jesus actually being given the wood on which he himself will be sacrificed on, and it's a very powerful narrative again. There's no evidence. Of course, Isaac was mortal; he wasn't the Messiah, but there's no evidence that Isaac's being punished for any sin here. Of course, Jesus was sinless. There's no evidence even. There's no reason given for this sacrifice at all by God, and it seems to be counter to everything in God's nature. And we'll find out later that there's an even bigger message in this. Okay. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. And the two of them went together, and Isaac spoke up and said to his father, to Abraham, Father, Abraham's. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went together. Now, I should have really read this in the King James. It kind of puts it a bit differently, but a bit closer to the Hebrew. In the King James, it says something like, God himself will provide the offering. Where you put the comma there, and Hebrew's full of all these plays on words, where you put the comma there, God himself will provide an offering, he will provide the lamb. But if you put the comma somewhere differently, God himself will provide the offering. God will offer himself as the offering for us. And God is, through Jesus, has made the offering for us. We're here today because of a very, very important sacrifice. And we all, we heard, all of us who heard Jeremiah's sermon 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago know that Jesus sacrificed himself without complaint and very willingly for us. And so this is another picture of God himself providing the sacrifice. It's a very beautiful picture, and one that we will be always thankful for. And then I'm continuing on to verse 9 here. When they reached the place God told them about, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood, and he bound up his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. So here the picture changes. Up until now, Isaac had been a picture of Christ, but now Isaac is a picture of us. Isaac is bound, I believe, hand and foot, and there is not one thing Isaac can do to save himself. Remind you of anyone? I know it reminds me of me. And the Bible says it reminds me of you too. See, there's not one thing we can do to save ourselves. It is only by the grace of God that we can be saved. And, we have been... Isaac at this point needed a substitute. And a substitute will be offered, as we all know from this story. And Jesus is our substitute. Jesus took our punishment because... Why? It blows my mind that Jesus would have such grace to go through what he went through. I'm not someone who has a great tolerance for pain. I don't like pain. Yet Jesus probably went through one of the most painful execution methods. Before that, he was beaten, mocked, scourged. And then to top it all off, he had the weight of the world's sins cast on his shoulders. For the likes of me and the likes of you. Why would Jesus do such a thing for us? I find it very, very difficult to fathom and comprehend. But Jesus has been our sacrifice and our substitute. Because we could do not one thing to save ourselves. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, here I am. And Abraham replies, here I am. And yet again, Abraham is submitting himself to the will of God and the faithfulness of God. Abraham has followed God, with a few exceptions, pretty faithfully all his life. Abraham is there were times Abraham slipped up. I talked about the whole incident with Elimelech. He actually did that twice. He sold his wife Sarah to Pharaoh before too, to be Pharaoh's wife as well. And then there's the whole Hagar and Ishmael incident, where and that's still causing us problems today. There are people, I believe, falsely, who are claiming to be the descendants of Ishmael, who are causing the world a lot of problems today. But by and large, God has been utterly faithful to Abraham, and Abraham in turn has trusted God and replied in faith. So Abraham makes himself available and allows himself to listen. And then, do not lay a hand on the boy. This is verse 12. He said, do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son. This kind of poses a problem for me, because Isaac wasn't Abraham's only son. As I mentioned Ishmael before, but he was Abraham's only legitimate son, and he is the one who Abraham's descendants will be counted by. God, but let's look at what happened here. It's kind of Abraham offered his only son. And again, this is another picture of God's redemptive plan for us today. That God gave us his only son. We all know John 3:16. For God so loved the world that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. When Jesus was baptized, God said, behold my son whom I am well pleased. Yet God sacrificed Jesus because in our stead. And then verse 13, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by the horns, and he went over and took the ram and sacrificed it in a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on this mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Now there's a bit of a dispute on what Mount Moriah is. A lot of people, and to be honest I would be more in this camp, say that this is where the temple was. And the temple was a place of sacrifice, and a place where literally or figuratively God dwelt. But there's another view on where Mount Moriah is. Some people think Mount Moriah is actually Calvary. Well, God has provided for us on it. I don't necessarily, as I said before, believe that Mount Moriah is Calvary, but God provided on a mountain. God provided on a mountain 2,000 years ago. And God provided Jesus for us on that mountain. And this is verse 15. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this, that you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make you your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of cities, of the cities of their enemies, and through your offering, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. And so Abraham offered Isaac, and Isaac, through Isaac's offspring, Jacob, Joseph, all the kind of the 12 sons of Jacob, the Jewish race became formed. And from that, Jesus came. And through that sacrifice, all nations have been blessed. And even even after that, sacrifices of many Christians who went before us have made it came to such a place where we can come here and then we can talk about the truths of God's Word. 500 years ago, tomorrow, in a place called Wittenberg, Germany, a man called Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to the Castle Church. It seemed like nothing at the time. A lot of people think that Luther only wanted to kind of start a debate. But what happened, what sprung forth from there, became Protestantism. And Luther himself, suffered a lot. He was excommunicated from the church. He stood trials. He was under death threat. But there's others who were burned at the stake. There was others who were all kinds of bad things done. I think some were hung, drawn, and quartered. One day there's something called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, where basically every Protestant in France was killed. Yet it's because of their sacrifice today that we can stand here and talk about grace and not talk about indulgences or going to confession or penitence. Although confessing to one another is biblical, but the actual sacrament is, in my opinion, not. But we can come here and worship, not be led, by just weirdness. We can come here and talk about grace and mercy because of the sacrifice of Jesus and because of the sacrifice of Isaac before, or the attempted sacrifice of Isaac, but the sacrifice of many people who have came after them even. And the Christian life is one of sacrifice. We look at the world today, and a lot of people are holding on to things. Some things are very deep identity issues and whatever. Sometimes I think we just have to trust God with the sacrifice, and trust God with the sacrifice of our own lives. It says in Romans that we are to be a living sacrifice, that we are no longer slaves to sin, but slaves to righteousness. That in itself is a sacrifice. If we are regenerated, of course, we have the Holy Spirit with us and helps us in that sacrifice. But it is a sacrifice nonetheless. In a worship song I really like, Matt Redman says, "Though there's pain in the offering." We need to look at ourselves and think of Christ's sacrifice as something that has given us grace and mercy and salvation ultimately. But at the same time, what can we give in return? There's nothing we can give in return that will save us, because there's nothing that we can do will save us, not of us. But what can we do in response to the mercy that God has given us? And I think, as I mentioned before in my own sermon a few months ago, we should live in a lifestyle of worship, a lifestyle just focused on honouring God every day. It's not really what we do in here that is the main point. It's what we do out there. I think one great way we've done it is through the blessing box, where we've been able to bless our community around us. And another great way is just to be there for people and to tell them about the love and mercy that Jesus had for them. Because a lot of people think Christians are really just people who are wanting to put rules on them and wanting to put all kinds of laws and whatever, when actually nothing should be further from the truth. Although it is true that a lot of Christians do like to put laws on people, nothing should. We need to be dependent on grace. And what I'm saying is not that we should just go and out and party and whatever all the time. But as Jeremiah has said so often, love Jesus and do what you love. See, if you love Jesus, you will do what Jesus wants, because you love doing what Jesus wants. I really love that concept of grace, because it is a really magnificent thing that it's not up to us. It really takes it out of our hands, and just a lot of people wear wristbands. What would Jesus do? And that's a very pertinent question. But a lot of people should really think, what has Jesus done? See, if you think of what Jesus has done and given everything for us, then how can we not live such a way that is honouring to Him? If you really think about it.